In the spring of 1843, a notice appeared in the Savannah Republican describing a woman without naming her. The advertisement did not offer her for sale. It did not list a price. It announced a demonstration, an exhibition of remarkable physical capacity, it read, a testament to Southern cultivation. The language was careful. It spoke of vigor, productivity, proof. It did not speak of ownership, though ownership was assumed. The plantation belonged to Elias Harrow, 47 years old, second-generation cotton planter in Macon County, Georgia. His yields had declined over the previous 2 seasons. Soil exhaustion had been blamed. Weather had been blamed. Labor discipline had been adjusted. Now there was something else to show. Visitors arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Carriages lined the edge of the drive. Men in summer coats stood in loose clusters beneath pecan trees. A few women accompanied them, though they remained near the house. Lemonade was served. The event was described as educational. At the edge of the lower field, near the weighing shed, a platform had been constructed from spare planks. It was not elevated enough to suggest spectacle, but high enough to prevent obstruction. A ledger rested on a small table beside it. The book was open. She was brought out at precisely 3 o'clock. No drum announced her. No speech preceded her entrance. She walked from the direction of the quarters, hands at her sides, posture upright. She wore a plain work dress, sleeves rolled. Her build was immediately visible beneath the fabric knot. Exaggerated, not unnatural, but undeniable. Broad shoulders, defined forearms, a back that held itself without curvature. Someone near the platform murmured, "Elias?" Harrow stepped forward and removed his hat. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will observe what consistent cultivation and proper breeding can accomplish." The word remained in the air longer than necessary. He did not say her name. 2 cotton bales had been positioned near the shed. Each weighed more than 400 pounds. Normally they were moved by 2 or 3 men with hooks and leverage. Harrow gestured toward them. She approached the first bale. There was no visible hesitation. She adjusted her stance, bent once, and lifted it from one side, enough to tilt and shift it forward several feet. Not carried, not thrown. Moved. A murmur passed through the observers again, more audible this time. Harrow smiled lightly. He turned to the ledger and wrote something down. The second bale was repositioned for clarity. She repeated the motion. The plank platform creaked slightly, though she had not stepped onto it. One of the visiting planters asked whether she had been trained specifically for this. Harrow answered without turning his head. She was raised on this land. The demonstration continued for another 15 minutes. Tools were handed to her annex, a weighted plow handle, sacks of seed. Each task was completed without strain visible to the eye. Sweat appeared, but no trembling. Her breathing remained even. Throughout the display, she did not speak. When it ended, Harrow closed the ledger and invited the men to inspect the figures recorded over the past 6 months. Output totals, acre coverage, picking rates. Her line was marked in darker ink than the others. "She produces nearly twice the average," Harrow said calmly. Sustained. A physician present at the gathering requested permission to examine her. Harrow agreed, though he remained close. The physician pressed her forearm lightly, then her shoulder. He nodded once. "Extraordinary constitution," he said. The phrase was repeated by others as they returned to the house. No one asked how often she was permitted. No one asked how long she had been measured in this way. As the visitors departed, Harrow stood at the steps and shook hands. He spoke of future demonstrations. He mentioned expansion. He did not mention her again by description or function. In the quarters that evening, conversation remained low. She sat apart from the others, not isolated, but unaddressed. Her hands bore faint swelling along the knuckles. When someone offered water, she accepted it without comment. A younger field hand asked whether it hurt. She did not answer immediately. "Work is work," she said at last. "Start the next week." A second notice appeared in the paper. It referred to the remarkable woman of Macon County. No name accompanied the phrase. Visitors increased. Harrow adjusted the schedule so that demonstrations occurred only after full field labor had already been completed. He described this as proof of endurance. The ledger grew thicker. Soon, other plantations sent inquiries. Letters arrived asking about lineage, about diet, about pairing. Harrow responded selectively. He wrote of strength as inheritance. He wrote of discipline as design. He did not write of her silence. In town, the story acquired shape. Some described her as unnatural. Others called her evidence of progress. A few expressed discomfort. Though not publicly, the newspaper continued to print favorable language. By mids, Harrow had constructed a sturdier platform. The physician returned once more and suggested moderation. Harrow thanked him and did not alter the schedule. One afternoon, during a demonstration attended by a county judge and 2 investors from Augusta, she paused before lifting the second bale. It was a small pause, a breath taken longer than usual. Harrow noticed. The pause passed. The bale moved. The ledger recorded the weight. Later that evening, Harrow revised the entry slightly. The number remained impressive. The margin appeared clean. That same week, a visitor asked her directly how she felt performing for strangers. She looked at him without expression. "I work," she said. The visitor laughed lightly, as if satisfied with the answer. By autumn, the phrase "most muscular woman" in Georgia began circulating beyond the county. Harrow did not correct it. He did not confirm it. He allowed the exaggeration to operate on his behalf. The demonstrations continued. The numbers in the ledger continued. Her name did not appear in print. By the end of the year, what had begun as proof of productivity had become something else, something closer to claim. A claim about design, about control, about what could be shaped and displayed as evidence of order. The disturbance was not her strength. It was the way that strength was being framed as success, and the way no one asked what would happen when the body being measured could no longer meet the numbers written beside it. By the winter of 1843, the demonstrations had been reduced to a schedule. Tuesdays and Saturdays, weather permitting, visitors received in the afternoon, the field cleared by noon, lemonade prepared, the ledger placed on its table. The system did not announce itself as a system. It presented itself as efficiency. Elias Harrow had begun rising earlier. He walked the perimeter of the lower fields before breakfast, inspecting rows that did not require inspection. He paused longest near the weighing shed, where the platform now stood, reinforced with iron brackets. He had hired a carpenter to widen it. The carpenter did not ask why. In the quarters, her mornings began before the others, not by instruction, but by expectation. A separate list of tasks had been attached to the inside of the toolshed door. It bore no name. It did not need one. The sequence was understood. Plowing before sunrise, lifting practice with stone weights. Behind the barn, cotton picking at mid. Demonstration preparation in the afternoon. The stone weights had not existed the year before. They had been shaped from discarded mill wheels. Each bore a number, carved into the surface. The numbers were not decorative. They were increments. Harrow had taken to time in her. A pocket watch appeared in his hand during the lifting. He did not shout instructions. He recorded intervals in the ledger's back pages. He adjusted rest periods downward. The physician's earlier suggestion of moderation had not been repeated. The newspaper continued to publish short notices. The Haro method, one column called it an advancement in agricultural discipline. The article cited productivity increases and referenced divine providence. It did not cite her. Letters arrived from neighboring counties asking about procurement. Haro replied cautiously. He described lineage as controlled. He implied selectiveness. He did not reveal the age at which he had begun field labor. He did not disclose the injuries recorded faintly in the earlier pages of his books. He had begun keeping a second ledger. This one remained in his study, locked in a drawer beneath correspondence. It contained more precise figures. It also contained adjustments. Days when her output fell slightly below expectation were marked with small crosses in the margin. Notes beside them read, discipline recalibrated, or diet modified. Her meals had changed. Extra portions of cornmeal were added. Salt reduced. Meat rationed differently. Haro described it as optimization. In the quarters, the changes were noticed without comment. Her arms bore new bruising along the inner elbow, from repeated strain. When asked how she felt, she answered as before. Work is work. The phrase traveled through the quarters as repetition, not affirmation. On demonstration days, the visitors grew more numerous. Haro had begun charging a modest viewing fee. Under the guise of charitable contribution, the funds were directed toward agricultural improvement. A new plow was purchased, the platform painted. She stood at the center of these transactions without being consulted. The system around her adjusted itself to support what was now described as proof of Southern advancement. A judge wrote a letter praising Haro's innovation. A preacher mentioned the plantation in a sermon about stewardship. The language aligned. She remained unnamed in all of it. The physician visited again in early January, this time at her request. The official reason was seasonal illness prevention. During the examination, he lingered longer than before. She is he said quietly. Haro responded by asking whether there was permanent damage. The physician hesitated. Not yet. The phrase settled between them. The schedule was not reduced. Instead, Haro shortened the public demonstrations and extended the private measurements. Visitors saw controlled exertion. The more demanding lifts occurred before dawn. A younger field hand began assisting with the stone weights. He counted aloud under Haro's instruction. When she paused, Haro tapped the pocket watch lightly. Not in anger, but as a reminder. The counting resumed. In town, speculation turned to possibility. If such strength could be cultivated deliberately, it could be reproduced. Articles hinted at selective pairing. Letters inquired about offspring. Haro answered without committing to specifics. He described potential without stating intent. In the second ledger, a new section appeared, labeled projection. The columns under it were empty at first. By spring, the pace had intensified. She moved through tasks without visible protest. Her breathing grew heavier after lifting, though the audience rarely witnessed it. Haro had repositioned the platform so that the crowd stood slightly farther away. Distance improved perception. One afternoon, a visitor from Augusta requested to test the bale himself for comparison. He attempted to shift it and failed. Laughter rose briefly, then subsided. Haro smiled politely. She has been conditioned, he said. The word replaced. Others that might have been used in the quarters. She began to wake at night, not from noise, from tension in her arms that would not release. She flexed her fingers, slowly, once, twice, before returning them to stillness. A woman older than the others observed her, hands, and said nothing. The system around her continued refining itself. The demonstrations became less about proof and more about expectation. Visitors arrived already convinced. The ledger was no longer consulted in full. Haro summarized the numbers aloud, rounding slightly upward. No one requested verification. Small fracture appeared in March. During a private measurement session before sunrise, she failed to lift the heaviest stone weight on the first attempt. The pause was brief but measurable. Harrow's marked it. He did not raise his voice. He adjusted the diet again. He shortened rest. The next week, she lifted it on the first attempt. The cross in the ledger margin remained. By early summer of 1844, the phrase "most muscular female slave ever bred in Georgia" appeared in a traveling pamphlet without attribution. Harrow did not publicly endorse the claim. He did not correct it either. The system had grown beyond the field now. It included rumor, print, expectation. It no longer required constant reinforcement. It sustained itself through repetition. Her presence had become a function. When visitors asked her age, Harrow answered for her. When they asked whether she felt pride, he said she understood her role. She was rarely addressed directly. In the study, the second ledger's projection column began to fill. Harrow calculated potential offspring yields as if plotting acreage expansion. The figures were speculative. They assumed continuity. The physician did not return again that year. By autumn, her lifting remained impressive, but her recovery slowed. The pauses between demonstrations lengthened. Harrow attributed it to heat. The audience accepted the explanation. The system had normalized the disturbance. What had once seemed extraordinary now required maintenance to appear inevitable. Her strength was no longer observed as anomaly. It was treated as confirmation. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the stone weights were lifted without witnesses, the numbers recorded did not always match what had occurred. Only the second ledger knew that. The fracture did not begin in the field. It began in the study. In late October of 1844, Elias Harrow opened the second ledger to complete his monthly projections and found a column misaligned. The figures from the previous week did not reconcile with the totals he had entered earlier. The discrepancy was small, 7 pounds unaccounted for, across 3 days of recorded output. He reviewed the entries again. The morning lifts had been marked as successful. The demonstration that Saturday had drawn a larger crowd than usual. The applause had been sustained. The numbers had been spoken aloud. 7 pounds remained missing. He recalculated. The error persisted. The first ledger, the public one, showed no inconsistency. Its entries were clean, rounded, persuasive. The second ledger carried the precision. Harrow closed it. The next morning, he adjusted the schedule again. He increased the private measurements, shortened the public display, and required an additional lift at the end of the day for endurance confirmation. She did not question the change. The added lift did not succeed. The failure was not dramatic. The stone weight rose halfway, then returned to the ground with a controlled descent. There was no collapse, no sound beyond breath. Harrow waited. She adjusted her stance and tried again. The weight moved slightly farther, then settled. The pocket watch ticked. Enough, Harrow said quietly. He wrote nothing down. In the quarters, her hands had begun to swell at night. The younger field hand who assisted with counting noticed. She no longer flexed her fingers before lifting. She kept them still, as if conserving motion. That afternoon's demonstration proceeded without visible disruption. The cotton bales were shifted. The crowd murmured approval. A visiting investor from Milledgeville remarked that she appeared leaner. Efficiency, Harrow replied. But the next day, the bale did not move as far on the first attempt. It was repositioned. The crowd adjusted. Harrow smiled lightly and described humidity as resistance. The audience nodded. The ledger entry for that day recorded the original distance. The fracture widened not in public, but in repetition. In November, a letter arrived from a plantation owner in South Carolina. Details about her breeding schedule. Harrow had anticipated such inquiries. The projection column in the second ledger had been prepared for this purpose. He drafted a response describing strength as inheritable, conditioned by structure and environment. He did not yet confirm any pairing. Before sealing the letter, He paused. The physician's earlier words returned. Not yet. Haro folded the letter and set it aside. It was not mailed that week. During a dawn session without witnesses, she attempted the heaviest stone again. Her breathing altered halfway through the lift. The weight rose a few inches, then her grip failed. The stone struck the ground harder than intended. The sound carried on. The younger field hand looked toward Haro. Haro's expression did not change. He glanced at the pocket watch. Again, he said. She bent. Slower this time. The weight rose. Halfway, then not at all. He closed the watch. No further lifts today. In the second ledger, he left the space blank. The blank space troubled him more than a failed number would have. By December, the public demonstrations had been reduced to once weekly. Haro announced it as exclusivity. Visitors increased their anticipation accordingly. The newspaper printed another brief column praising Georgia's living proof of agricultural mastery. The phrasing no longer required explanation. The claim had been absorbed into regional pride. In the quarters, she moved with greater caution at night. The older woman who had once observed her hands noticed a tremor when she reached for water. You should rest, the woman said. Rest is measured, she replied. The phrase did not repeat. One afternoon, during a demonstration attended by a county official, she paused longer than before. The cotton bale remained upright, unmoved, for a visible count of 5. The crowd shifted. Haro stepped forward. Humidity, he said again. She lifted Dot. The bale moved enough to preserve the impression. But something had altered. The audience's murmur carried uncertainty this time. That evening, Haro examined the public ledger and adjusted the week's total upward slightly to compensate for earlier shortfalls. The rounded number appeared convincing. The second ledger remained open. On his desk, the blank space in the November column remained unfilled. A small cough began to accompany her lifting. It was not constant. It appeared only after exertion. Haro noticed, but did not record it. In early January of 1845, a traveling physician stopped at the plantation on unrelated business. Word of the demonstrations reached him through town gossip. He requested permission to observe privately. Haro agreed. The physician watched a dawn session from a distance. He said little during the lifts. Afterward, he approached her directly, ignoring Haro's proximity. How long have you been measured this way? He asked. She did not answer. Haro responded instead. Long enough to establish consistency. The physician examined her shoulders and wrists. His touch lingered. She will not sustain this, he said finally. Haro's jaw tightened slightly. She has sustained it, he replied. The physician did not argue further. He departed before the public demonstration. That afternoon, the bale slipped from her grasp, mid-lift. It did not fall heavily. It shifted sideways, rolling slightly before settling. The crowd fell silent. Haro stepped forward immediately. She is fatigued from earlier work, he said calmly. The land requires much this season. The explanation sufficed. But the fracture was no longer confined to the second ledger. Visitors began to ask quieter questions, not publicly, not in print. They asked whether the earlier claims had been exaggerated, whether the first numbers had been experimental, whether the method required revision. Haro responded with composure. Results fluctuate, he said. The principle remains. In the study, he reviewed the second ledger again. The projection column, once promising expansion, now appeared speculative in a different way. He had calculated strength as inheritance. He had not calculated depletion. The blank space, in November, stared back at him. He considered revising earlier entries downward to align with recent decline. The thought passed quickly. To alter the past would be to admit instability. Instead, he began reducing the frequency of recorded measurements. Less data meant fewer contradictions. In the quarters, she began to wake before the bell without instruction. She sat upright, hands resting on her knees, waiting for the first light. When the dawn sessions were shortened, she did not remark upon it. The system adjusted again, not outwardly, but through omission. Demonstrations became selective, invitations extended only to trusted visitors. Newspaper notices ceased. The phrase, "most muscular female slave in Georgia," continued circulating, but now as recollection rather than announcement. The fracture had surfaced. Moral clarity gathered in the spaces between what was seen and what was written. Legal clarity did not follow. There was no law governing exhaustion of a body treated as asset. There was no statute addressing miscalculation of human capacity. There were only ledgers, and in one of them, a blank space that refused to reconcile with the story being told. By the spring of 1845, the demonstrations had become memory more than event. The platform near the weighing shed remained in place, its paint beginning to peel along the edges where sun and damp had alternated without mercy. The iron brackets still held firm. The stone weights remained stacked behind the barn, but the schedule no longer carried the certainty it once had. Tuesdays passed without visitors. Saturdays drew fewer carriages. Don Elias Harrow explained the change as strategic withdrawal. Scarcity, he told a neighbor, preserved reputation. Yet, he continued to rise before dawn, habit unbroken, and walk the path toward the lower fields with a pocket watch in his coat. The second ledger had grown thinner. Blank spaces appeared more frequently than figures. Harrow no longer attempted to reconcile each absence. He closed the book earlier in the evenings now. In the quarters, the rhythm of labor returned to something closer to the ordinary brutality of plantation life. Plowing, picking, hauling tasks, shared rather than isolated. The specialist once tacked inside the shed door had been removed. Its nail remained, rusting slowly. Her body had not regained what it had lost. Strength remained, but it had shifted less. Explosive, more guarded. She no longer practiced with the heaviest stone weights. They sat untouched, dust gathering in the carved numbers. The younger field hand, who once counted repetitions, now worked beside her in silence. The counting had ceased months earlier. Neither spoke of it. In town, the newspaper printed a brief correction. Not a retraction, but a redirection. It praised Harrow's innovations in discipline while shifting attention to crop yields. The phrasing soft, the spectacle dissolved into agricultural efficiency. The phrase that had once traveled most, "muscular female slave in Georgia," began to sound exaggerated when repeated aloud. Without weekly proof, it thinned. Harrow noticed out one afternoon in April. He requested a private demonstration. No audience. No official observer. Only the platform, the bale, and the pocket watch. She stepped forward without hesitation. The bale had been reduced in weight, though he did not mention it. The adjustment was small enough to guarantee movement without inviting scrutiny. "Lift," he said. She bent, placed her hands beneath the coarse wrapping, and raised it steadily. The bale rose, shifted, and settled into the new position. With a faltered, Harrow watched the entire motion without consulting the watch. "Again," he said. The second lift required visible effort. Breath left her sharply at the top of the motion. He closed the distance between them. "Enough," he said. There was no applause to absorb the word. Only air. That evening, Harrow opened the second ledger and wrote a single line beneath the last. Recorded measurement. Performance stabilized. He did not specify at what level The moral fracture had begun as discrepancy now settled into something quieter. Not remorse, he did not name it that. Not recognition, he avoided the word. It manifested instead as reduction. He reduced the demands, reduced the measurements, reduced the scale of the story he told others. He did not reduce ownership. In the quarters, her sleep deepened for the first time in months. The tremor in her hands lessened. The cough faded gradually, though it did not disappear entirely. The older woman who had once advised rest watched her lift water buckets one morning and nodded slightly. No words passed between them. Summer arrived without announcement. The fields demanded their usual toll. Heat replaced speculation as the dominant force on the land. Visitors ceased entirely by July. The platform remained unused. Harrow received fewer letters. One inquiry from South Carolina arrived, asking whether the method would be available for transfer. Harrow replied curtly that circumstances had shifted. He offered advice on crop rotation instead. The projection column in the second ledger remained unfinished. One evening, after supper, Harrow carried both ledgers to the study fireplace. He did not burn them. He placed the public ledger back in its usual drawer. The second he set aside, unopened, atop a shelf where correspondence gathered dust. The blank spaces no longer demanded resolution if they were not examined. Outside, the night insects moved in steady rhythm. In the quarters, voices murmured softly before settling into rest. She sat just beyond the doorway, hands open on her knees, as she had in earlier months, but now the posture carried no anticipation of measurement, only stillness. The system that had once expanded around her contracted without announcement. It did not collapse. It dissolved through neglect. No proclamation marked its end. No article acknowledged decline. In town, another spectacle replaced it. An exhibition of mechanical threshing equipment. Progress required constant novelty. Strength remained her own, though it had never been named as such. On a late August morning, while hauling water alongside the others, she lifted a bucket in one smooth motion that would once have drawn applause. No one commented. No ledger recorded it. The act belonged to the day, not to performance. Harrow watched from a distance. He no longer carried the pocket watch. What remained unsettled was not physical capacity, but narrative. The story he had told of proof, of method, of inherited advantage had thinned under its own arithmetic. Without repetition, it lost authority. The moral clarity that had hovered unspoken now existed in absence. In the removed schedule, the unused platform, the shelf-bound ledger, there was no apology. There was no public reckoning. There was only the quiet recognition that a body treated as instrument had limits not subject to calculation. In early autumn, the platform was dismantled. The boards were repurposed for fencing along the northern boundary. The iron brackets were stored in the shed. When the last board was lifted, the ground beneath it showed no mark distinguishing it from any other patch of earth. By winter, the story had faded into anecdote. Harrow rarely mentioned it. She moved through the fields as before, deliberate, unnamed in print. The extraordinary had been folded back into the ordinary cruelty of the system that remained intact. But something subtle had shifted. The silence that followed the spectacle did not restore justice. It did not grant freedom. It did not erase harm. Yet, it refused the lie of inevitability. And in that refusal written, unrecorded, all ledger closed. Winter of 1846 arrived, without ceremony. Frost silvered the fence rails that had once been the demonstration platform. The boards bore faint nail scars, where iron brackets had held weight meant for a spectacle. No one passing the northern boundary would have known their history. They functioned now as simple enclosure. Elias Harrow had taken to spending more time indoors. The study fire burned earlier in the evenings. Correspondence concerned acreage, seed prices, rainfall predictions. The language of yield remained intact. The second ledger remained on the upper shelf. He had not opened it in months. On the plantation, labor continued in its ordinary, grinding pattern. Cotton Rose did not care for prior narratives. Soil did not preserve applause. The body that had once drawn visitors moved within this continuity no longer isolated for display, yet still bound within the same system of ownership. Her strength had settled into endurance. It no longer announced itself in singular lifts. It appeared in sustained motion, the steady haul of water buckets across uneven ground, the rhythm of chopping wood through cold mornings, the careful lifting of sacks without haste. Nothing theatrical, nothing recorded. Among the quarters, memory of the demonstrations lingered in fragments. The younger field hand, who had once counted, repetitions avoided looking toward the shed. He had learned something during those dawn sessions about measurement, about the way numbers could compress a person into proof. He did not have language for it, but he recognized its absence now. The older woman spoke of the period only once. "They watched you like weather," she said quietly one evening. She did not respond. Weather was endured, not consulted. In town. The mechanical threshing exhibition that had replaced her notoriety had already faded. A new cotton gin design occupied conversation. Progress moved restlessly from object to object. Human bodies, when no longer novel, receded from attention. Harrow understood this rhythm. He had relied upon it. Yet something in the winter quiet unsettled him. One night, after a letter from a neighboring planter mentioned the earlier strength enterprise with faint irony, Harrow climbed the small stool in his study and removed the second ledger from its shelf. Dust rose when he opened it. The blank spaces remained where he had left them. November column. The unfilled projections. The small crosses marking decline. His handwriting, once confident and compressed, appeared strained in later pages. He read through the entries without interruption. At first, he regarded them as calculation, then as chronology, then as evidence. The numbers, once persuasive, now felt brittle. He noticed for the first time how often the word discipline appeared in the margins, how frequently he had described adjustments to diet, rest, repetition. The vocabulary framed compulsion as refinement. He turned to the final line. He had written, "Performance stabilized." The phrase had served as closure. Now it seemed evasive. Stabilized at what cost? The ledger did not calculate cost. Outside, wind pressed against the study windows. The fire shifted. Harrow closed the book, but did not return it to the shelf. The next morning, he walked the lower fields without the pocket watch. Frost soft beneath his boots. Laborers moved in slow, steady patterns against the cold. She was hauling wood toward the cookhouse. The motion was controlled, neither strained nor effortless. He observed from a distance, as he had done many times before, but the angle felt altered. There was no platform, no audience, no expectation of proof. Only work. He approached. She did not stop moving. For a moment, he seemed to search for the language he had once used so easily. Efficiency, yield, conditioning, none fit. "You are well," he asked finally. The question sounded foreign in his mouth. She set the wood down carefully before answering. "I am working," she said. The statement was neither defiant nor deferential. It described fact. Harrow nodded once and stepped back. The exchange unsettled him more than any failed lift had. In the following weeks, he made small, practical adjustments across the plantation. Rest intervals lengthened slightly. The heaviest hauling was redistributed among teams rather than assigned to individuals. These changes were not announced as correction. They were framed as seasonal prudence. no one in town remarked upon them. The system remained intact. Ownership did not dissolve because of a ledger reconsidered in winter light. Yet the intensity of measurement did not return. The stone weights behind the barn were eventually repurposed as anchors for fencing posts. Their carved numbers faced inward toward the soil. In early spring, a traveling preacher delivered a sermon in town about stewardship and mercy. Harrow attended. The words drifted over him without immediate effect. But one phrase lodged unexpectedly. What you account for shapes what you believe you own. That evening, he reopened the second ledger and turned to the blank November space. He did not fill it with a revised number. Instead, he wrote a single word across the empty column, Limity. He did not show the entry to anyone. In the quarter's life continued under constraint. Freedom had not been granted. The law had not shifted. Fields still demanded labor under watchful eyes. But absence's spectacle altered texture. She no longer woke before dawn in anticipation of measurement. She no longer calculated breath against a ticking watch. Strength existed without witness. There is a difference between exploitation and exhibition. The former remained. The latter had ended. One afternoon in May, while repairing fence along the northern boundary, she paused near the boards that had once formed the platform. Her hand brushed a nail scar along the wood. The mark was shallow, almost erased by weather. She did not linger. Were called from the field. In the study, the second ledger stayed open on Harrow's desk for several days. He added no further entries. Eventually, he placed it in a trunk beneath old tax receipts and folded correspondence. It was not destroyed, but it was no longer consulted. Years later, someone opening that trunk might have found the book and puzzled over its careful arithmetic, its sudden blanks, its final word. They would not find her name. The account recorded numbers, not identity. Yet between the figures and omissions, a pattern would be visible. Ambition rising, intensifying, correcting, retreating. The arc of a man attempting to render a human body into proof. Encountering limit. Limit did not undo harm. It did not return stolen time. It did not grant autonomy. But it resisted the illusion that capacity could be extracted infinitely without consequence. In the late summer of 1846, during a heavy harvest day, a bale shifted awkwardly on the wagon. Several hands reached to steady it. She moved among them, placed her shoulder beneath the weight, and pushed with measured force. The bale settled. No applause followed, only continuation. The field absorbed the moment without record. And for the first time since the spectacle began years earlier, her strength belonged entirely to the task at hand, not to a story constructed around it. The ledger was closed, the land remained, and the account, though never balanced, had finally acknowledged what it could not control.